Fabio Vighi is the star here of Emergency Capitalism, our new Friday series every other week. We're starting again. We had a little break there. It's my fault, but Fabio, welcome back to Emergency Capitalism, and thanks for coming on again.
Oh, thank you again for having me, Doug. It's great to be here again.
So I wanted to talk about, we're going to be talking about geopolitics and the banking system and the way the financial markets are influencing global politics. But before we do, I've been arguing with people in a fruitless way on Twitter. And it was all about masking and vaccines and ivermectin and things like that. And my position is that leftists should know the obvious by now, which is that the mask mandates were never really going to work, and they were known not to work. That ivermectin may or may not have some effect on COVID, but the way that it was disparaged had more to do with backing big pharma and trying to enforce a state policy than it had to do with scientific evidence. What else? The vaccines didn't really stop the spread, and should never have been universally given to young people. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think are obvious now. I don't know if you agree with all of them, but
and more.
Well, yeah, and more. But I feel like those are actually very moderate.
Yeah, they are
sensible positions, right? Yeah, and like I'm not going out on a limb at all. No. I don't have to go to any obscure source. That's sort of like generally recognized in the mainstream now. Why do you think it is that people, especially on the left, have such difficulty with even those kinds of moderate, obvious, consensus-driven opinions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's a question of faith, ultimately. I think having faith in a system that tells you what to do, right? In a state, especially, that tells you what to do, that has the authority and the knowledge that it can tell you what to do, and you have to believe it. Because if you stop believing it, then everything crumbles. Your whole world crumbles, falls apart. You know, your old certainties, your old sense of living in a reality that makes sense in a society just falls apart. So ultimately, I think it's one of those beliefs, you know, belief before belief. You know, I don't even know why I believe in it, but I have to believe in it. Because otherwise it's almost like an unconscious attachment to the system, no matter how obvious it is that they were lying and that the system itself is far from being trustworthy because it's in a condition of crisis, so it's more likely to lie to you about things like that. But ultimately, I think the faith in the system prevails in a lot of people, particularly leftists, who've always trusted the state to do the right thing, right? There's always been this contrast of state politics and capitalism, as if there were two separate things, almost. Or rather, that the state does the right job at minimizing the effects of wild neoliberal capital, right? Whereas I think they've just missed the point here. The point is that there is no difference anymore. The state just does the interest of capital, quite literally. You know, it's been taken over, it's been colonized by capital in its latest form, which is highly financialized and hyper-indebted capitalism. So I think ultimately it comes down to that. Like, I can see that in people around me. I could see it in people around me, older people who come from a different generation. Maybe they had reasons to trust the system back then. And I think the last thing they want is to give up on that belief, because if they give up on it, then their own identity just falls apart. I think that's my explanation of it. I've been thinking a lot about it because, as you say, it doesn't make sense. It's not rational. It really is not the rational thing to do. It becomes an irrational form of attachment. Almost like people refuse to engage in discussions like that, rational discussions, because ultimately the desire to believe in the consistency of the system and in the truthfulness of the state or whatever, the authorities prevails. Is stronger than anything else. I think that's what it comes down to. Ultimately, I think it's an existential form of attachment. Would you agree with that?
I do. What I've noticed lately also is that there's a feeling like if you continue to raise these issues, at least a few people have said to me, well, listen, this is old hat. Move on already. But they won't say, like, I agree with you. Move on already. They'll say, you're trying to generate a right-wing audience.
Wow.
And that's not going to work. That's old hat. Move on already. And it's like, okay, wait a minute.
They want to move on, right? They don't want to think about it because there's almost a sense of guilt that they failed to see what was happening. Right? That's what I perceive, a sense of repressed guilt, like I didn't see it, but now I don't want to think about it because it's too painful to confront.
Right. I think there's a feeling of powerlessness amongst most of the, especially younger leftists, like people who are younger millennials and the people who are Zoomers. And so if they do feel guilt, it's actually a fairly neurotic guilt. I mean, the younger people don't really share much of a burden for what's gone wrong over the last 2 decades, say. And because most of them were like, what, children in diapers or 10 or something when this all got started. And so that there's no need for most of these people to feel guilt. But those who are a little older millennials who are actually actively involved, they do share some responsibility for the failures. And guilt is a good thing because the guilt is supposed to move you to rectify the situation, make amends, change your ways, take up your guilt. The shame gets you stuck, but guilt is good. You should feel guilt. It's an advanced form of emotion, I think, when you feel guilty about something.
Maybe you're right. Maybe it's more shame, but I feel even with the younger generations, there's there's also this idea that they to an extent they've been brainwashed, this polarization of politics and of culture, etc. They're very susceptible to that. They're very susceptible to that kind of manipulation, which is often made on moral grounds. If you don't believe this, then you're a bad person because you believe that. So there's that, if I've encountered it so many times that you have to believe in masking, face masks, because if you don't, then you're a right-wing populist, or even a Nazi, or a sympathizer of far-right extremism and so on and so forth. And so it becomes a polarized moral argument. And I think younger people are particularly susceptible to that polarization. They want to be on the good side of history. They want to be on the side of the good, and therefore that's why they all sort of did what they were told to do. A lot of it, I think, is lack of critical awareness, and the system is clearly nurturing, this sort of lack of critical awareness in the younger generation. I think the education system is preparing them for this sort of decisions, almost where it's black and white. You don't have to think too critically about it. Just, exactly, if you don't make the right choice, you should be ashamed of yourself because you are aligning with the wrong people and the bad guys. I think this is part of manipulation itself that we're seeing. So it's almost, I try not to engage in discussions like that because, first of all, because I probably would lose my job if I did with my students. So I don't want to get there.
Right.
Really, but because I think it's a bit of a waste of time. The reaction I got the couple of times I did was, as you said, it's okay. That was a while ago. We should get over it. It's gone. There's no point, thinking about it again.
Yeah, I mean, this is the logic, right? During the crisis, during the lockdowns, there was no time to think, and you were being it was dangerous to question the given narratives, the received opinion. So you were shut down on that basis. Now it's no longer really a live issue. The mask mandates have been lifted. We're not locked down at the moment. COVID is a non-story, and to talk about it is old hat. It's a boomer move. We should all have forgotten about that already.
Yeah.
And that strikes me as creating a situation where we become spectators to our lives and never intervene or learn from anything. And this is, since I was a young person on the left, I've been a fan of and have read and reread the Situationist International,
yes.
the Society of Spectacle. And if there's something that I've carried with me upon a recent rereading, it would be that our society is one which wants to eliminate history, and most specifically recent history. The things that are setting up our politics right now are what we most are compelled to and commanded to forget.
Yeah.
And COVID is a perfect example of that. The lockdowns are a very obvious example of a bit of history that's pretty current, still recent history that we're being compelled to forget, often by people who would claim to be the most radical.
Right.
So it's.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the polarization there was very, very strong, and that's part of the manipulation. You really couldn't, if you even raised doubt, and I did at the time, even within circle of friends and family and etc., you're immediately labeled as some kind of lunatic, right? As some kind of a conspiracy theorist or a right-wing, exact conspiracy theorist. You could not raise any doubt. The situation was so black and white, and the moral blackmail was so strong that it just kind of preempted any kind of discussion, because that's a fact. And on top of that, you put science, this sort of mythical science that we were all supposed to believe in, and that strengthened the argument in favor of the authorities that wanted us to behave in a certain way. But I feel like that the moral blackmail that was at the heart of it, I think it was really not just about the young people, but everyone, 80-90% of the population ultimately fell in line and towed the line with what they were told to do. Because, and that's my ultimate explanation for it, they knew that if they started doubting those in positions of power that wanted to do good for us, that's what they said, right? The whole system would just crumble. Even their own belief in themselves as part of this system would crumble. They wouldn't be able to sustain it. Ultimately, it was about their own almost narcissistic preservation, their own personal preservation. It was about them, their identity. If I don't believe in the system, then it means that the system doesn't believe in me. And who am I after that, right? And I think that's ultimately what they were exposed to. It was a real existential choice. And that's why it's important to understand what the system is doing and where it is at the moment in terms of its consistency, its narratives, its socioeconomic sustainability, right? The term sustainable should be used for the economy, not for everything else as we tend to use it for, right? It really is the health, the state of the economy that needs to be questioned, and nobody wants to question that. Because I think it was very clever the way COVID happened in terms of, I remember people saying, "What do you think the capitalists will want to shut down the economy? They're losing out too. Capitalism cannot shut down because the economy is king, and you have to run the economy and so on." So missing the logic behind it, that at that point, the best thing to do for the system was shutting down the economy because it needed to refill. Like we talked about it before, it needed to print trillions of money and throw it into the system, and it couldn't do it with the economy running. I mean, it's a clever logic. I mean, it's so easy to deceive people like that, right? I remember talking to my father also, and he just couldn't get it. He couldn't get how capitalism could benefit ultimately from COVID, from shutting down the economy and from destroying a lot of work, a lot of jobs. And I think to understand that, you got to understand that the economy today is mostly, I mean, non-labor economy. It's mostly virtual economy. It's financial economy. It's algorithms working with investment indices, and so on and so forth. So it requires a certain, I think, set of critical tools that a lot of people simply don't have, or they don't want to have. Obviously, the older generations are still very much believing that the baby boomers will be there forever if they only want to be. If they only apply themselves, they would be rewarded and they would be rich. Like, they managed to become rich in the post-war period. So they don't understand that there's a historical development of capitalism. It's a trajectory. It peaks and then it falls, and then it dies eventually, like every system. And this is, I think, almost like a cult of faith. It's that idea of metaphysics having fallen down to the ground, like Walter Benjamin used to say, that capitalism becomes a kind of secular cult, a secular religion, because it requires faith in its invincibility, faith in its, the fact that it will never die. It's an unsurpassable system. So yeah, ultimately that's the kind of explanation I gave myself of those behaviors.
So just to walk through this again, and we should maybe save some of this for Rumble, but
we'll try to use secret codes and secret language.
right. But okay, so what I want to ask you to get to the topic that we raised, that we were going to discuss in this episode, the current situation coming after the lockdowns and the shutdown of the economy and the pumping of trillions of dollars into the system, the kind of artificial liquidity that was created during lockdowns. We're now facing what looks to me like, and I think most people would agree, is the slow ramping up of what promises to be or threatens to be, which may never be another world war, the full-on world war, where not these little skirmishes and proxy conflicts, but superpower states against superpower states. And my question, I guess, to you is: do you think that this too is kind of a coordinated effort to attempt to devalue capital and pump more fictitious capital into the system through weapons acquisitions and things like that? Or do you think that this conflict is maybe a bit more organic and outside of the realm of the control of the administrative state, the global administrative state? Or is that the wrong way to ask the question?
No, I think it's a great question. And I think there are different reasons why we are where we are, right? It's not just that they simply want to print more money. I think it's part of it. It's part of it. Any crisis, any emergency, whether it's now or just projected into the future, right? It's even by projecting into the future, it creates certain economic conditions, and also it creates fear. And fear works very well as a distraction as well, right? As we know from COVID, people think about the war obsessively, think about the nuclear apocalypse, and therefore they forget that they're getting poorer and poorer, that inflation is taking away the purchasing power. So I think it's a number of things rolled into one. ultimately it's about the sustainability once again of this economic model, which is already bankrupt. It's already bankrupt. It's already unviable. It's debt chasing debt. So the whole system itself is already dead. Technically, it's simply surviving by printing more money and throwing it at it. It's a very simple thing to understand, but people need to understand that capital that is created is no longer productive in the good old capitalist terms. It doesn't create value for the people, right?
Right.
We're not.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit.
Am I cutting out?
Yeah, you are, but you're coming back. Let's see if we can proceed.
Are you there? You're still there? Cool.
I am here. Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, sorry, because it's good. So yeah, I was saying that the war, first of all, yes, it allows to create a condition of potential disaster, and that is always good for creating money out of thin air, to be thrown at, for example, particularly in the very specific case of the military-industrial complex in the US. It's very important, because it is the military-industrial complex. It is a massive industry essentially that it's not necessarily productive in terms of value, right? But it needs to be supported. It needs to be supported through more credit or debt, whichever way you want to put it. It needs to be fed, and so on and so forth. So, and then you think about the financial sector. Who's driving the financial sector now? It's companies like NVIDIA, particularly NVIDIA. And NVIDIA is into artificial intelligence, advanced technology, robotics, etc., etc. That's in itself connected with the armament industry. It's all connected at that level. So you see that the military-industrial complex, propping up the military-industrial complex serves different purposes, even in terms of financial capitalism. That in itself is a good reason to have a war or the threat of a war. And more importantly, it's important to have an enemy that has to be seen as evil, absolute evil, the incarnation of evil. Now, what was it? A few days ago, there was the anniversary, I think the 80th anniversary of the landing in Normandy. And Joe Biden went over there and who popped up? Zelensky, right? And he started hugging all the veterans and so on and so forth. So Normandy very weirdly became Ukraine. And and so when Biden was talking about the sacrifice of American soldiers to liberate Europe from Nazi fascism, all of a sudden twisted that argument and that narrative, and it suddenly became a narrative about saving Europe once again from the new Nazi guy, which happens to be Putin, right? The new potential invader, the new imperial force or whatever that Europe should be, that is now encouraged to fight against, right? Ironically,
they have to fund literal Nazi battalions in order to fight off the Nazis. It's
right, and
like
Russia sacrificed 27 million people of its people in the fight against Nazism. So when you talk about sacrifice, you should invite the Russians, maybe, right?
Yeah, right.
Because they contributed a lot to that fight massively. But what I'm trying to say is that the system needs to have an external enemy all the time. It needs it very badly, because that creates, first of all, it kind of immunizes the system. It creates a sense of, if you're not together against the enemy, then we're in trouble. And that logic allows for almost anything. You can create money out of nowhere. People have to make sacrifices. Forget about they're getting poorer. They're doing it for a good cause. We're fighting the system. We're fighting the monster. So I think war, as I see it now, is very much as a threat rather than as a real war. I don't think the West, the core collective West, is stupid enough to go to war with Russia, because there's no guarantee that. I mean, it's more likely that they will be pulverized than anything else, because the military might that Russia has accrued over the last few years. It's listening to military experts from the West too. It's pretty obvious that it's better not to pick that fight with Russia.
I remember the Cold War fairly well, right? I think I'm older than you are, Fabio, a little bit, right? And maybe I'm
I think
53.
we're same age.
Okay.
Sorry? You're 53.
I'm 50. Yeah.
Oh, then you're younger. You're a lucky boy.
Oh, okay. Well, you look young then.
I'm 55.
I'm so used to being the oldest one. So
listen, you look.
I'm all right. Well, then you and I both remember the Cold War. But what I remember living in the United States during the Cold War was that the threat of the Russian or Soviet army, the threat of the Soviet military might was constantly pushed on the American people. I lived in a military town too, in Colorado Springs. And I went to a Catholic high school for a little while because I was a discipline problem. So I got sent to the Catholic high school to have some sense beaten into me. And I recall
Catholics. You know that.
No, I was not Catholic. I was an atheist.
Right.
And but I was just like, we got to send you somewhere to get. Yeah. So, but anyhow, I was at this Catholic high school and we had a mandatory meeting, and some mucky muck from the Air Force was there. And he was telling us how much power the Soviets had and how we were underprepared for the conflict, and they had so many more missiles and so many more men, and we had to spend more and recruit more and then after the Soviet Union collapsed, it turned out that that really wasn't the case. I mean, the United States had more military might than the Soviet Union by many magnitudes, not necessarily in terms of nuclear missiles, but it was it was pretty much parity there. And I would think that the United States and Europe today are not pushovers when it comes to military might, but the problem is that there really is no way to have a conventional war as we used to conceive of it because of nuclear weapons. It's been that way since 1945, and so now it's all play acting. It seems like Iran will send missiles in to Israel, and Israel will shoot them down. It's all negotiated. At least that's largely what happens.
I agree with you that it's mostly a kind of pantomime, theater. There's just threats and so the point of this is to create fear once again, right? It's kind of paralyzing fear that we got to do what they tell us to do, otherwise, God knows, we will be invaded or we'll be nuked or so on and so forth. So again, it creates a condition whereby you can really establish authoritarianism, through fear, and it works. It's worked with COVID because that was fear too, and it can work with Putin and Russia. The other point is there can always be an accident, right? An accident could always happen. I mean, it's delusional to think that this situation of theater of pantomime can be completely controlled. Something can always happen that triggers a reaction, and then before we know it, it's the end. It's mutually assured destruction. It's before we know it. So we're kind of playing with fire here. I still believe, like you, that it's theater. Nevertheless, theater requires some forms of conflict, right? As we know in the Ukraine now, it's been going on for more than 2 years. So it requires people to die. It requires a lot of sacrifice, like literally in terms of people dying, like 500,000 Ukrainians, and etc. I've already, and the country's being destroyed. So there's that. So it doesn't have to be a nuclear war to be destructive, but also it would take little to trigger. It could happen that the theater becomes real because of an incident that wasn't supposed to happen, but it just happened. So yeah, I wouldn't be too comfortable with the idea that they're just bluffing.
No,
Despite the fact that I believe. Despite
Yeah.
the fact that I believe that they are bluffing, ultimately I believe that they are bluffing, that they know that they couldn't be able to sustain, this sort of nuclear confrontation.
Yeah,
So
well,
there are other
but other
reasons for
weird
it.
thing is, like,
Sorry.
in the war with Ukraine and Russia, the U.S. military, it looks like to me, has been acting aggressively towards Europe. Blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, that was a disciplinary action on Europe as much as it was
Well,
an
yeah, one of
attack
the
on
arguments,
Russia.
the aim of this, yeah,
Go
one
ahead.
of the argument is that that the actual target is not so much Russia, but it's ultimately Europe, right? Europe shall not have economic relations with Russia. We should stop the possibility of Eurasia to form, a unique sort of economic area, because that would be a threat. They become too strong for us, and we would lose empire. We would lose our dominance, economic dominance over the world. And I think that's plausible. That's another reason why they're pushing this war. And the weird thing is that Europe is saying yes. Europe are going along with that. They're saying, yeah, no, it's not so weird. I mean, weird. If you think about it geopolitically, Europe is a branch of Washington almost. It has been built into being a branch of Washington, so of American power. So it's not that weird, but still, it's quite something to see European leaders to simply acquiesce, with this demand of whether it's sanctions or even using military equipment, missiles, and so on, deep into Russian territory, knowing full well that if the Russians don't play ball, they retaliate. The Europeans will be the first to perish. Again, so it's very stupid. It's very, very stupid, regardless of whether it's a bluff or not. Economically, of course, Europe have everything to lose from this, too, with the sanctions, but breaking away from Russian gas and so on and so forth. Germany is already paying the consequences. And then you have European elections, and everybody's surprised that people either don't go to vote, or that there's this shift to the right, because people are so dissatisfied with this sort of European elite government that is taking Europe into this direction.
Mm-hmm.
It's self-destructive for Europe. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me that one of the aims is certainly to prevent Europe from having economic relationships with Russia here, and demonizing Russia really works. And the other point is that Russia is a perfect case for this, because historically they've always been demonized, whether they were tsarist, socialists, or capitalists. They still retain these Asian characteristics that, there's a racial component there, right? There's a strong racial component that turns them into this kind of crazed, power-seeking demons almost, that they need to be resisted. There's really some kind of racial discrimination going on there, in this Russophobia that has been created artfully, not only now, but it goes back, a long time. It goes back a long way, I think that it was bound to happen. It had been nurtured and for a while, for a few years, and then it exploded. And I think NATO knew what they were doing by pushing closer and closer to the Russian border. Number of incidents before, then obviously the Maidan Square coup. I mean, you don't have to go through all that again, but it's pretty clear that they were provoking Russia into a reaction. And then when Russia did react, then the situation was kind of perfect to create the new emergency, right? To create the new virus, almost. Putin as the new virus. And as soon as that happened, COVID disappeared, right? It was literally overnight almost. That all of a sudden it was the end of COVID, and the media started pushing the new sort of military emergency, the war, the unprovoked. How many times did we hear that word? Unprovoked attack, invasion.
Yeah, that was a lie.
A lie. It's totally provoked.
Right. But what I noticed right after the invasion of Ukraine was that the very same mechanism that had been used to suppress dissent against the lockdown policies were used by the same people, down to a man almost, to suppress dissent against the U.S. policy in Ukraine and to fight the Russian disinformation around Ukraine, which was anyone who dared to criticize or point out the truth, which is, for instance, that there was a chance for peaceful negotiations 2 months in to that conflict, and certainly even before that conflict began as well. We're about 36 minutes in here. In a moment, we'll switch over to Rumble, but I do want to dig in just a little bit more on the economic and financial mechanisms that are at work to set up, the lockdowns, to set up the wars, and I what comes to my mind, and you can help me straighten this out, but is the fact that in reality, Russia and Europe and the United States and China and even Israel and Iran are all part of a network of relations, capitalist production and exchange. They rely on one another. We certainly rely on Chinese production in the United States. China likewise relies on U.S. production and financialization. Russia and Europe have a close relationship through exchange of natural gas and other commodities. And they would again, so the question becomes: given the interdependence of these nations, what is causing the fracturing of the world geopolitically, or amongst the rising nationalism, and especially considering that just by the logic of the system, it's not ultimately going to work. We are in a global capitalist world, and we're not going to be able to, nation by nation, run our own affairs internally completely. We're always going to have to be having enough cooperation between nations to sustain this always changing economy. What I think I understand some basic reasons from my reading of Marx as to why these conflicts arise, but
I think
do you think that the policymakers, the world leaders, the bureaucrats, ultimately are still trying to work it out so they can maintain cooperative exchange between nations, or have they, basically bought into their own ideology, drank their own Kool-Aid, and truly see one another as enemies at this point?
I don't think they will completely break away from it, but I think we need to consider two different stages in which we are. I mean, in terms of the West and the BRICS nations, as they as they call themselves now, right? I think the two types of capitalism. Yes, they're both capitalists, so they share the same categories. They're run by the same categories. That's why, incidentally, I don't really have much hope in the other side. A lot of people, a lot of old socialists have a lot of hope in Russia, China, etc. I have a little bit less, because I think they're just catching up with us, and they will get exactly where we are now soon, faster than they think. So where we are now is that the system depends entirely on its financialization. on derivatives, on sustaining this massive bubble, this everything bubble, which is got nothing to do with society anymore in terms of so far as wealth is created in a not through labor but through speculations, etc. Right. So we're talking about hyper financialized capitalism, and also very much in debt, right? Massive problems with the debt that we have and that we have to refinance. I was reading today that within the next 12 months, the US will have to refinance 10 trillion of sovereign debt. 10 trillion. And how do you get, where do you get the money to renegotiate, to refinance that debt, to buy that debt, or to renegotiate the conditions of that debt? You need a lot of money. You're going to print it. You're going to find ways of printing it and throwing it into the system, whichever way. Maybe there's another pandemic or whatever, but you'll find a way to do that. And the result of that would be more inflation from everyone. So who's going to pay for that model? People like you and me. Our purchasing power would be destroyed, eroded even more, for the sake of the financial system to stay where it is, to be saved, right? So we're going to pay for it. That's where we are now in the West, particularly. In Russia and other countries, there's a different kind of situation insofar as they can still rely more than we can on real production. That doesn't make them much different, but they still are able to perceive themselves, at least, a bit different. And I think the idea is that they want to decouple from the model of globalization that was ultimately imposed by the United States over the world, right? Because let's not forget that was an American project, very much, right, based in the United States. So they want to decouple from it and create their own capitalist system, not much different from ours, but which is more centered on production, where maybe the currency would be once again tied to gold, for example, or a real commodity. So I don't think they'll be able to necessarily. It's very much early days. They really don't know how to do it themselves, I don't think. But I think they are trying to detach from what I think they perceive that is a system that is doomed, right? It's doomed. It's doomed to bankruptcy because of the reliance on debt that it has. But apart from that, I think that some relations, economic relations, will persist inevitably because it's in the nature of advanced capitalism to have them. And ultimately, I also believe that both systems are bound to self-destroy, because now we passed the point where capitalism can be productive as a social narrative,
Yeah,
based on intensive labor. And we go back to that point. We've been talking about it before. But whether you're in China, in Russia, or in India, the conditions will soon be very much the same for everyone.
Just to back you up a little bit on that, I'm just looking at the Atlantic Council's website. They have a piece that came out in March, and it's titled "China is Failing to Address Its Economic Challenges." Now, obviously, the Atlantic Council is a propaganda organ, but nonetheless, maybe they're saying something true here. They say a regulatory crackdown on leading private companies in the e-commerce and online services sector has sapped the economy of vitality. Total investments by corporate giants such as Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, but is that right? Baidu plummeted 40% in 2023, and employment in the sector has been hit by layoffs, depriving millions of recent college graduates of job opportunities. It seems to me that as they try to head off financialization in China, they pay economic consequences on the level of production.
They do. They do, because ultimately we go back to this idea of competition. If you want to compete, you need to employ machines, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. And that eliminates labor, productive labor, and that eliminates the possibility of a country producing value for its own people. So this is something that, this is the inner limit of the system as a whole. Whether you're in China or in the US or in Russia, you will run against that wall sooner or later. So I think we are running against it sooner than other countries, but they are not far behind at all. It's the same logic. It's the same logic. It's just that some countries are getting there a little bit later than us. I'm talking about the West and so on and so forth. So we are much more financialized than them, but they are equally financialized to a certain extent, and they're also relying very much on debt themselves. Like China's got massive. It's just that it's much more centralized and you can control it in a different way. But we're talking about the same issues, very much the same issues. That's why a lot of people are talking about these conflicts being completely fake, because ultimately the leaders of these superpowers are constantly talking to each other. They know that they are more or less on the same boat, and if the boat goes down, everybody will go down. They're all on the Titanic, and they can't. And I think there is some truth to that. I think there are conversations all the time, regardless of what we're told. But again, things can also get very ugly very soon, for other reasons, because all of a sudden it becomes necessary for one country, out of desperation, to have a war or to have some sort of conflict that then turns into a nasty war. So it's not so black and white. It's much more complex.
We've been talking for 45 minutes. I do think we should move over to Rumble, because I want to talk to you about some ideas that might get us labeled a conspiracy theorist or something like that, and might be banned on YouTube. But so, if you want to continue watching, move on over to Rumble. There'll be a link to it in the description. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment. Leave a comment if you disagree with Fabio and I. If you think that we're wrong about the masks, or if you think we're wrong about the nature of the COVID lockdowns, leave a comment. Of course, I'll probably get grumpy with you, but go ahead. Look for the link to Rumble in the description.